Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Dr. Annie Polland became president of the extraordinary Tenement Museum in January 2021 after previously serving as its executive vice president of programs and interpretation. She launched the museum's exhibitions Shop Life and Under One Roof, which for the first time incorporated cutting-edge interactive projection technology into spaces that were historically recreated. It was thanks to those innovations that the museum won the 2013 Multimedia Installations Muse Award from the American Alliance of Museums. Polland received her PhD in history from Columbia University. She was vice president of education at the museum at Eldridge Street, where she wrote a definitive history of the synagogue, and executive director of the American Jewish Historical Society. Annie is the co-author of Emerging Metropolis: New York Jews in the Age of Immigration with Daniel Sawyer, part of the City of Promises series, which won the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. Welcome, Annie.
Thank you. It's
Great to be with you. So the Tenement Museum, I hope everyone who is watching now has been, because if they haven't, they're missing out on one of the glories of not just New York, but the Jewish world.
Well,
but for those who might not have been there ever or recently, can you just give us a kind of on one foot, what is the Tenement Museum? Why does it exist? Or maybe how did it come into being? What does someone expect to see if they visit?
Great question, because often I meet people, there's a lot of people I meet, who say, oh, I've been there, I love it. And then there are other people like, yeah, I've never been. I've been meaning to go. So especially New Yorkers. I feel like a lot of New Yorkers will send...
It's like we haven't been to the Statue of Liberty if we live here.
Exactly. So the Tenement Museum is housed in two tenements on Orchard Street on the Lower East Side. The first one was built in 1863, and it had residents until 1935. And then the second one is on the corner of Orchard and Delancey, and we use that building to interpret the lives of immigrants and migrants who came to New York after World War II. So kind of the second one picks up the story of the first one. And so all together, we're able to look at the lives of Jewish immigrants, Puerto Rican migrants, Chinese immigrants, Italian immigrants, German immigrants, Irish immigrants, and then East European Jews and Sephardic Jews. So all of them at one point in time had apartments and created homes in these tenements. And so what we do is we research the stories of those who lived in the building and then tell their stories through educator-led tours. So one would expect to see, a tenement that's been preserved and in some cases recreated.
They're tiny rooms.
They're tiny rooms.
It's incredible that people live there. Sometimes multi-families.
Exactly. And so sometimes, again, when we are giving tours, if the visitors from out of state, they look around and they're horrified by how small it is, about 325 square feet. But folks who live in New York kind of are like looking around and like, oh, I could move this there, that there. So for New Yorkers, it's not that.
I could have the sink in the bedroom, the bath in the bedroom.
Exactly. IKEA could make something for this. But once you kind of look at the census record and understand that 10 people could be sharing a 325 square foot apartment, then you start to imagine what was day-to-day life like. And then you start to realize, they were sewing in this space as well, and it was a workspace. Then it starts to kind of, all the tensions and the anxieties as well as the hopes are kind of layered together. And
just in terms of the authenticity of furniture, of fabric, of lighting, how is all that? Is that all historians who put that together? And is that fixed or does that change if someone's visiting more than once?
Yeah, so different apartments are different stories, and then all of it is researched by historians, and then there are furnishings curators who go into the past and do all the research to then source the appropriate furniture. So the furniture that you're in, let's say you're in the Levine family apartment, that's not the furniture of the Levine family exactly, but it's researched to be period appropriate. Because what happens is, and my guess is, I know you had grandparents that lived on the Lower East Side.
Yes.
My guess is you don't have their furniture.
Right.
Because the whole point was tenement furniture. You escape from the tenements. These are not heirlooms that you pass down. And so we have to go and find them. But when you see wallpaper, for example, all the wallpaper is kind of taken from wallpaper remnants that were on the building itself. So we source and use the building as a teacher as we do the recreation.
And you just said that the building is the teacher. As I was researching you, I see how much you as a historian are a believer that kind of the structure itself is memory.
Absolutely, and I was just reading, Bill Moyers wrote an introduction, wrote a speech about the Eldred Street Synagogue, and one of the things he said is they, meaning the immigrants, they published in brick and mortar. And so like when we're talking about the lives of ordinary people, or even we're talking about the day-to-day lives of extraordinary people, we don't have a lot of source material because people didn't always write about their day-to-day lives, and those who were working 14 hours in a factory, for example, also didn't have the time to kind of reflect and write down their stories. So what we have to do is we have to look at the buildings they lived in, the buildings they might have decorated, and so material culture and the built environment of New York City offers us so many clues, I think, in piecing together their lives. And so doing that in tandem with the written sources helps us put together a more complete story.
And it feels very animated. It is not like just fixed and sort of dusty on the page.
And then visitors, what's great about that, and this is something I learned giving walking tours many years ago as a graduate student, visitors, they don't have to have read 20 books before they come on a tour and to be prepared. They just have to be there, use their eyes, look around, and start to ask questions. And that's what I love about kind of public history and the built environment, is it kind of levels the playing ground or the field and allows people to come together and learn.
So Ruth Abram, I'm lucky enough to know. She's a friend of my mother's. I don't know Anita Jacobson, but just tell me about the founding, because this hasn't existed for all time.
Yes, and I think Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson are just incredibly
heroes,
innovative, and especially think about the 1980s. People were not talking about this kind of history. It would be very hard in many universities to take a class just on like immigrants or immigrant lives. I mean, that was starting to happen in the late 1960s, but it just wasn't necessarily mainstream when people thought about American history as much. But what they were doing is, they understood the importance of this history. They understood that the tenements were a great place to teach that history. And then the other thing they understood was that this was not just the territory of one immigrant group, but rather the Lower East Side. What made it so exciting was that it offered the possibility of telling the lives of many different immigrants.
It was a gateway for Italians. It was a gateway for, you were mentioning Asian communities. Which in particular would you say spent most time?
Chinese immigrants,
for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like Chinatown now.
Exactly.
And in terms of the Jewish story, it seems so formative. I mean, maybe it's just the cliche in my mind and crossing Delancey and all of that. But aside from kind of the romance of it, what is the reality of kind of the numbers, if you have them, or a sense just of the wave of immigrants that came through the Lower East Side?
Yeah, it really depends on the decade that we're looking at. So again, one of the things that I think was so brilliant about Ruth and Anita is that they said they were going to interpret the space for all of its life. In other words, most historic houses are keyed to one moment in time. If you go to the Merchant's House Museum, or it's one time period, one specific decade. What they did is they said this building is not just one time capsule, but a series of time capsules, and therefore they can interpret these different moments. So in the 1860s, it's mostly German immigrants with like a small number of Irish immigrants that live in the tenement. So we get to the 1870s, you have German immigrants starting to be mixed with East European Jews who start to arrive. 1880s, more and more East European Jews, and the East European Jews kind of dominate the tenements of the Lower East Side in the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s. But then by the 1920s, you see more Italians moving into that part of the neighborhood as well. And I should mention Sephardic Jews who start to come in the late 1900s and 1910s.
So you just personally, to back up your story, you actually mentioned that you were doing walking tours of Lower East Side when you were at Columbia. Yeah. And what made you actually kind of sign up for that, and how did it whet your appetite to do more?
I'm trying to think. I feel like when I first got to graduate school, and I chose...
Most people waitress or something.
Yeah, I did that too. I had a stint at EJ's Luncheonette. It was not memorable.
EJ's, yes.
Yes, I was not very good at it. I had to wear a baseball cap, which was not very flattering. But I did that while taking Yiddish all day one summer. And working in the rare book room of the Jewish Theological Seminary. So it was a really interesting mix.
That's quite a mix.
Yes, but so I feel like I might have even went to the Tenement Museum and wanted to get a job, but they weren't hiring at the time. And then Big Onion Walking Tours employed graduate students to do these walking tours. And it was, I guess, in my second year of graduate school that I started doing this work, and I fell in love with it because it was a way to take what I was learning uptown and in the library and in the archives and kind of bring it to life, because the Lower East Side was like a stage set for all of these ideas. And yeah, I loved it. And I come from a family of teachers, so to be out on the street teaching and learning was really exciting. So that was very formative.
And you talk about that you love the idea of bringing history to people through the stories of ordinary people, which can sound like a cliche, but if you kind of step back, we often just focus on the most famous leaders and kind of, you know, the outsized figures of our history. It's rare that we look at the person who was just getting up every day and trying to make ends meet, send their kids to school, and often, you know, not having the language. So just what is the power of ordinary people, you think, as a window for the kind of history that you're communicating? Yeah,
great question. I mean, I just think most people are ordinary people. So there's somewhat distorting to focus, right, on the famous. And I see the way in which people can relate also to the lives of ordinary people, so that's a wonderful tie. And you really can't name any historic event that isn't illuminated by understanding how ordinary people experienced it or even shaped it. So at the Tenement Museum, we're able to look at, you know, the Panic of 1873. The Panic of 1873, of course, affected, you know, magnates and railroad, an economic depression. So it's going to affect bankers and all of those people, obviously, but it's 25% of the working class that is unemployed at that time period, right? So it's really having this outsized effect on a neighborhood like the Lower East Side and Lower Manhattan. The Great Depression as well, right? It has such an impact on the people who live in the tenements. So to be able to kind of look at those events through those lenses offers so much insight.
And what about post-Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, that also. So, I mean, I think the Lower East Side, and specifically in the Jewish mindset, when we think of the Lower East Side, it's often the turn of the 20th century, right? The era of the push carts. And that's so important, incredibly important. And, you know, obviously we've devoted a lot of time to that. But what was really illuminating for us when we started working on 103 Orchard and looking at the families there, one of which was the Epstein family, a family that the parents had survived the concentration camps, met in a DP camp, came to the Lower East Side where the father's uncle lived and worked in the garment industry and created a home in 103 Orchard, had 2 children. And we tell their story as a post, you know, World War II time period alongside the stories of a Chinese immigrant family and a Puerto Rican family that lived in the building. And so what I learned in doing this was that the Lower East Side was actually the most diverse neighborhood in the 1950s in all of New York. And so you have these older white, you know, what we would now say ethnic groups, like Italians and Jews, and then you had the refugees, and then you had Puerto Rican migrants, you had African American migrants coming from the South, and then you start to have more and more Chinese immigration. So that's all playing out on the Lower East Side. And it is amazing to really think about how people are forming relationships with people that came from different corners of the world.
But just the density of the diversity, which, you know, particularly now, which is not really being so celebrated the way it had to be then, or at least the reality of it.
Exactly.
Changed the way someone approached, I'm sure, other groups.
Yes, and so Bella Epstein, who born in 1948, grew up on the Lower East Side, talked about her best friend was Rosetta de Benedetto, who was an Italian girl. And Bella has this vivid memory of Rosetta's white confirmation dress and shoes and how much she wanted that. Or she also has vivid memories of like sugarcane that was sold on the streets of New York. She also has a memory of an African American girl that she met in the playground and would play checkers with all the time. So that, you know, here, that was her world. And it was a world shaped as much by the Yiddish newspaper or the Yiddish radio her parents played as much as, you know, Paul Anka's Diana that she played on her record player. So it's just, I think, interesting to kind of think about how diversity is experienced. And, you know, a source we might use is like how, you know, a demographic pie chart, but that means very little. We can look at a demographic pie chart and get numbers, but what does it mean to share space? That's another story.
So you took this job not at the most auspicious or easy time, right? Smack in the middle of the pandemic when people could go nowhere, basically.
Yeah.
So you have a museum that's all about immersion and being, as you said, in the space, and people can't be in the space. So how did the museum pivot, and how did you not feel daunted by that challenge?
Yes, it was definitely a challenging time, and January is not often a month that offers lots of hope, especially in the Lower East. It's just a bleak month, and so to go into work and to go to a place and to return to a place that I had been there from 2009 to 2017, the end of 2017, and then to come back in 2021. So when I left it, right, I would walk into the building and the shop was overflowing with people, with merchandise, with conversations, or go into the buildings and see people learning. And to go into an empty building, take the elevator up to my office, look out onto Delancey and Orchard Street, which were really quiet at the time, was jarring in many ways, personally.
And then there was financial duress.
Of course, yes. And so, first of all, I have to give so much credit to Morris Vogel, who was the interim president, who really, I think, bore the brunt of the hardship of the pandemic and had to make a lot of very important decisions and really did a lot to save the museum and put it on a good footing. So,
and a lot of people, private donations.
Yes, there was a wonderful story in the New York Times written by a wonderful reporter in arts and culture.
Who happens to be my twin.
Who happens to be your twin.
Although there's no conflict of interest here. I'm an independent, but Robin's piece, I think it really made people suddenly say, this is life or death.
Exactly. I think that the headline was something to the fact that a museum that tells a story of people's struggles now faces its own struggle or its own fight to survive. And it was, I think a lot of people realized that this was a place they had visited and they loved, but they didn't think of it as something they had to support necessarily. And I think this changed the mindset, and I hope that that is something that is permanent. Not that we're always going to be struggling, but that people understand that if you love a cultural organization, you need to support it, because it doesn't just, this is
survive
not,
on its own.
It doesn't survive on its own.
Yeah.
And so about 4,000 new donors emerged.
Wow.
Some giving very small amounts, some giving very significant amounts. All of it helped save the museum, and I think allow the museum to pivot, and in the time during the pandemic when the building was closed, to think about virtual programming, for example, and staying in touch with a national audience. So if there were silver linings of the pandemic, it was the kind of understanding that the museum is a place that needs to be supported, as well as this opportunity to use virtual programming to reach people well beyond the Lower East Side.
Everywhere, and we should play some of the videos that you created that ultimately anyone can find, right, wherever they are. They can just get a taste of what these rooms feel like and what some of these lessons and stories that you're weaving. I also want to talk, before we leave the pandemic, about the post-George Floyd reckoning that every institution had to do and how the Tenement Museum responded to that moment.
That's a great question. And I think, just to rewind a little bit, I think the original footing and orientation of the museum was helpful in the sense that this was a museum that wasn't just going to be a Jewish museum or an Irish museum or an Italian museum. It was going to be a museum where we looked at the working class immigrants and migrants of all backgrounds, as many as we could find, who lived in the buildings. And so that meant that the orientation from the beginning was about pluralism. There was a cosmopolitanism to it, and that then allows for many different stories to be told. That said, the story of Black New Yorkers wasn't told at the Tenement Museum, and that was done for a reason. There were no African Americans that we could find that ever lived in the building, and the museum had, been designed to tell, or the museum had evolved to tell the stories of people who really lived in the building. But what happened even before George Floyd was a realization that we should tell the story of a Black family that lived in the tenements, if not in our own tenement, then in another tenement. And that kind of emerged from sources that we had in telling the Irish story. We told the story of Joseph and Bridget Moore, an Irish family who lived in our building in 1869. We would pass around the city directory, which signaled to people, Joseph Moore, a waiter, lived at 97 Orchard. But what started to happen on our tours is people looked at that document and they saw things that we hadn't noticed at first, which was that there was a Joseph Moore, also a waiter, right, directly above our Irish Joseph Moore, and it said colored next to it, or COL''D. And visitors asked, what does COLD mean? And then, oh, he's a Black New Yorker. He's also a waiter. He has the same name. What was his life like? So the museum had started to research his story and the story of his wife, Rachel, and had started also to create a walking tour of the neighborhood called Reclaiming Black Spaces, and then went more and more into the story of Joseph and Rachel Moore, and decided that we should create an apartment that tells their story in relation to the other stories in our building. So that was happening even before George Floyd. But I think the George Floyd moment and the reckoning that our country is still doing and will need to do for many years, it's not just one moment or one summer, I think that gave more drive to it, more attention and more focus.
So you said, Annie, you said, yes, we're a museum of New York. Yes, we're a museum of immigration. Yes, we're a museum of the working class. But ultimately, on a really good tour, there are conversations where people are starting to appreciate the limitations and the opportunities of what it means to be an American in a different time, in a different context, and in a different moment. Mm-hmm. I would just love you to end, if you could, by just exploring how does this museum help us look at our identity as Americans?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think because you're in that space, you're starting to connect to other people. So that experience of empathy, I think, connects you to both the historic figures that would have lived in that apartment, as well as to the people who are around you when you're learning. So in other words, the Tenement Museum brings people together for tours, and you're with strangers, you're forming community with strangers. And I think that's another element of it. And I think one of the things I've seen as we've reopened and have given tours is that people are so excited to be with other people. When you go to the Met, you're with a lot of people, but you don't know their names. And at the Tenement Museum, you come together, you learn people's names, you study history, and people start to talk with each other about that history. And that brings up all sorts of questions about what it means to be American. Is America about individuals? Is it about community? Is it about the good times, or is it about the bad times? Is it about resilience? All of these are questions that come up. And what is the role of women in all of this? I mean, that's another question that's been in the news a lot, right? And the tenements offer a specific lens on that. And so,
because they were holding up the home.
They were holding up the homes. They were economic providers. Even if they weren't listed in the census record as economic providers, that's what they were doing. They were bringing the Sabbath into the homes. They were trying to help their children negotiate a changing world. And so I think one of the things about the tenements is because so often tenements housed newcomers, whether they were newcomers from across the Atlantic or newcomers of migrants who came from New Jersey, right? So Joseph and Rachel Moore, or Joseph Moore, is from New Jersey. They all entered the city and were new to the city. And I think there's something about being new to the city that heightens one's consciousness and makes one think and absorb it. And so to pull all of our visitors into that drama of everyday life and recreating a life on New York soil, that I think is super exciting and kind of leads into all sorts of
and
conversations.
I should point out, because my family did it, you can also book a private tour and take your family. We did it as a family reunion, and it was quite powerful to go together. And then, of course, we ate afterwards, because you have to eat after a museum.
Yes.
But it's just the sense that we all had some kind of tether to the tenement history, but it also brought us together to talk about our own family history.
That happens all the time. And I think what's great is because we're uncovering history that people might not know, they start to look at their own story, what they thought they know, what was handed down to them. And almost all the time, people are learning new things about their own family, because an aunt brings up, oh, did you know this story? And like the nephew didn't know that story. And that, I think, coming to the Tenement Museum helps you appreciate the lives of the people who lived in the tenements in the past. But no matter what your roots are, family history as a whole comes up, and the idea of story and how stories are passed down. So yes, come to the Tenement Museum, learn about others, and learn about yourself as well.
That's a perfect note to end on. Annie, thank you for being with us today and for this memorable conversation. And I could not emphasize more, underscore more what Annie said. Go to the Tenement Museum. If you have been before, go back, take your family, take your grandchildren, take your friends, experience something that is exquisite, I think unique, not just in New York, but in our country, and connects you to a sense of past and how important it is for us to understand our stories so we can tell new ones. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Thank you for joining us for In the Spotlight. I will see you next time.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.